Liam Doyle had never been the type to chase chaos or conflict. For the better part of his adult life, he'd worked as a state-certified safety technician, traveling across counties inspecting pressure valves, electrical systems, and outdated agricultural machinery on dusty rural properties. It was a job that required precision, a good head for codes, and a quiet tolerance for bureaucracy. Liam was good at it, maybe too good. After nearly 2 decades of chasing other people's hazards and cleaning up messes that weren't his, he'd had enough. Following the unexpected death of his younger brother, his only remaining family, he decided to cash in his retirement early, take the modest inheritance he was left with, and disappear into a piece of land that no one else wanted. The property sat just outside Boise, Idaho, a little over 40 acres of rough, unkempt terrain tucked between low hills and a winding gravel road that seemed to forget its own path halfway through. It wasn't picturesque by any stretch. The grass was patchy, the soil neglected, and the only standing structure was a rusted, lopsided barn clinging to the earth like a drunk trying not to fall. But Liam saw something in the land that others didn't: a quiet dignity, a chance to build something that wasn't weighed down by politics, procedures, or people. So he bought it outright and clean. No loans, no liens, no obligations to anyone but himself. For the first few months, Liam kept to himself. He installed a modular home on the high slope, converted the barn into a workspace, and methodically began clearing the brush, tilling the land, and bringing the infrastructure back to life. He rerouted the well lines, replaced the electric fences, and even got a small solar grid up and running. Every day was the same rhythm: wake before the sun, check the boundaries, tinker with systems, and spend the rest of the day pushing his body through the stubborn resistance of soil and time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and for the first time in years, Liam felt like he was building something that didn't require compromise or explanation. The only wrinkle was the gated community that had sprouted half a mile east of his property, a prefab luxury development named Juniper Hollow, marketed as a sustainable utopia for progressive landowners who value security and harmony. Liam had driven past the gate twice before closing on his land and immediately knew it wasn't his kind of place. The homes were nearly identical, their yards manicured to unnatural perfection, with plastic-looking turf and artificial stone pathways that seemed allergic to actual dirt. The residents, from the few interactions he had at the nearby general store, spoke in the carefully curated language of policy and passive aggression. Most were not farmers or ranchers, they were remote workers, consultants, green lifestyle influencers, and ex-urbanites who fancied themselves stewards of the land without ever having shoveled a foot of it. And at the center of it all was Karen Beckett. Karen was not the kind of woman who made casual appearances. She arrived, asserted, and remained. She had a voice that could cut through drywall and a smile that felt like it was hiding something sharp. Her role as president of the community board, what they called their Environmental Standards Committee, was something she carried with religious pride. From the very first week Liam moved in, she had made it abundantly clear, through an unsolicited welcome packet, that while his property technically sat outside their jurisdiction, mutual cooperation between neighbors was strongly encouraged. The packet included a laminated sheet of voluntary community guidelines and a map with a faint, dotted line extending over part of his western field, with the words "proposed shared green space buffer" written in pastel font across it. Liam tossed the packet into his burn barrel without ceremony. He didn't owe them anything. At first it was all quiet. Karen stayed in her lane, Liam stayed in his. He assumed that the committee would eventually move on to more cooperative targets, some retiree in need of approval for a rose trellis, or a tech couple trying to build a second driveway for their electric car. But then came the water request. It was phrased delicately in an email that arrived from a neighborhood address, junipercomboard@outlook.com. The message asked if Liam would consider allowing partial access to his well for hydration of the shared community garden, citing a recently passed emergency drought clause in their bylaws. The email was filled with flattery and appeals to neighborly spirit, but the tone was unmistakable. They expected compliance. Liam didn't answer. The next day, a small hand-painted sign appeared on the edge of his eastern fence line, right where the two properties ran closest. The sign read, "Community Water Relief, donate your excess to help others." It was staked into the ground 2 feet inside Liam's property. He removed it that evening and didn't say a word. 3 days later, a pair of middle-aged men in HOA polo shirts walked up to his gate while he was hauling a generator out of his barn. They didn't open it, just stood there calling his name with forced cheeriness, holding a clipboard. Liam ignored them and kept working. After a few minutes of awkward waiting, they left. That night, someone pried open the outer casing of one of his irrigation hubs and tampered with the pipe flow. The pressure gauge was busted, and he lost nearly 400 gallons before sunrise. Liam reported it to the sheriff's department. A deputy came out, took photos, and gave a nod that meant nothing would come of it. It's probably just kids. These areas have been seeing more foot traffic from the subdivisions. The deputy offered, before climbing back into his cruiser and driving off without writing a single thing down. It wasn't kids. The next week, Liam noticed something even stranger. Several of his tools had been repositioned inside the barn. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged, just moved. His wrench was on the wrong peg, his bolt tray inverted, and one of his seed storage bins was left open with its lid set neatly beside it. No animal could have done that. Someone had been inside. He changed the locks the next morning and added 2 more motion lights to the front and side entrances. He didn't bother filing another report. No one was going to help him. That wasn't paranoia. It was the reality of being outside the grid while still living close enough to be in someone else's crosshairs. And yet, despite it all, Liam wasn't scared. He wasn't intimidated, or shaken, or even angry. What he felt was the same sensation that had guided him through every system failure and crisis during his years in field inspections, the sense that something small, barely visible, was beginning to buckle, and if you didn't reinforce it now, it would collapse in a way that would be too costly to fix later. So he fortified the property. He reran his boundary lines, updated his legal documentation, added clear private land, no trespass markers every 50 feet, and had everything notarized and digitally archived. He reviewed his firearm registrations, completed a refresher at the local gun range, and joined a private legal assistance cooperative for landowners. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible from the outside, just good, solid ground preparation. But the thing about preparation is that it only works if people play by the rules. Karen Beckett didn't play by rules. She made them up as she went, then rewrote them when they no longer suited her needs. And while Liam had always believed in staying civil, keeping to himself, and avoiding unnecessary escalation, it was becoming increasingly clear that what he thought of as restraint, Karen saw as weakness. He'd left the city to find peace. What he found instead was a war over the one thing he had left to defend, his land. And he wasn't going to lose it without a fight. The first real crack in the fragile standoff came not with a confrontation or threat, but with a package. It arrived without warning one gray morning in early spring, left neatly on Liam Doyle's porch bench with no postage, no sender, no tracking code. The box was the kind used by local utility services for delivering parts plain, industrial brown, sealed with reinforced tape. At first, Liam assumed it was a late delivery of replacement wiring for his fencing unit. But when he opened it, he found something that instantly stilled the air around him: a folded clipboard with duplicate carbon forms, a roll of hazard tape, and a worn, delaminated badge from a now-defunct regional water management bureau. Beneath it all lay a printout, an official-looking letterhead claiming to be an assessment request for water redistribution compliance. At the bottom, someone had scribbled his name and property address by hand. The paperwork looked real enough at first glance. But Liam had worked with bureaucratic forms for years and could read inconsistencies like others read typos. The margins were wrong, the file reference was outdated by at least 5 years, and the contact information led to a disconnected phone line. It wasn't a real inspection order. It was a prop. Someone wanted him to believe an official agency was preparing to intervene. The implication was clear. Your resources are under scrutiny. We're watching. Liam stared at the badge, flipped it in his hand, and felt a familiar tightness in his jaw. This wasn't a prank. This was strategic psychological pressure. That same afternoon, he walked the eastern edge of his land, retracing the invisible line that separated his autonomy from Karen Beckett's kingdom. Near the old livestock trail that ran parallel to Juniper Hollow's outer bike path, he noticed fresh tire tracks leading up to one of his southern gates. It wasn't a main access point, but the gate had been unlocked for months, more habit than oversight. Now the lock was gone, the chain neatly laid on the ground, as if someone wanted him to see it had been removed, not broken. He stood in the dirt for a long while, staring at the clean imprint of a lug tread and the faint boot prints beside them. They were too deliberate, too staged. Whoever had come through wasn't just exploring, they were staking familiarity, leaving behind evidence without consequences. 3 days later, an email arrived from the same community board address that had once requested water sharing. This time, the tone was different. It stated that a joint residential safety initiative had recently been approved in a unanimous vote, and that Liam's proximity to the shared watershed zone placed him within what they called a mutual compliance corridor. The message stated plainly that access may be required in the coming weeks to inspect soil runoff, groundwater pressure, and any community impacting infrastructure on adjacent parcels. There was no request, only a declaration. No official agency was listed, only the names of 4 board members. Karen's printed first. Liam deleted it without replying. But the next morning, his phone rang. Not his cell, which he used sparingly, but the hardwired landline he'd installed specifically for service alerts and emergencies. The caller ID showed a local number, but when he answered, there was a moment of silence followed by the unmistakable click of a recorded message starting mid-sentence. It was a female voice, digital and toneless, stating, "Your property has been listed for non-voluntary assessment." He advised that failure to comply may result in legal escalation under County Ordinance 421A. Liam didn't recognize the statute. When he tried to trace the call, the number vanished from the logs as though it had never rung at all. He spent the next several hours going through the county database, pulling up every active ordinance related to land usage, environmental compliance, and water redistribution. There was no 421A, there had never been. He wasn't shocked. He was being gaslit slowly, methodically, through a campaign that used fragments of official language, bits of real policy, just enough to rattle nerves and plant hesitation. But Liam wasn't wired to hesitate. He printed everything he had: emails, screenshots, photos of the gate, even the contents of the mysterious box, and drove them down to the nearest sheriff's substation. He wasn't naive enough to expect a full investigation, but he needed something documented, something on record. The deputy on duty was young, unsure, and clearly uncomfortable once he read through the documents. He offered to make copies but didn't promise action. Liam left with a copy of his own report and a quiet understanding that law enforcement, at least for now, was going to stay out of it. 2 nights later, just past 1 a.m., a power surge triggered a relay failure on Liam's southern field grid. The lights blew out in sequence, starting near the barn and cutting north like a falling curtain. When Liam walked out with a flashlight to inspect the breakers, he found something far more troubling than a popped fuse. His backup generator had been opened, its casing unscrewed and left hanging. The wiring had been tampered with, not by animals or weather, but by a human hand. One of the relays had been bridged using a copper strip Liam hadn't seen in years, the kind used in outdated municipal systems. It hadn't caused a fire or destroyed the unit. It had just shorted it, deliberately. No damage to speak of, no traceable theft. But it was a message: we can reach you. That's when Liam made the decision to hire private help. He didn't need a bodyguard or some ex-military hammer swinging through his gates. He needed someone with eyes and a quiet presence. Through a contact in the landowner's legal cooperative, he got the number of a licensed rural investigator named Mitch Rowley, a former insurance field examiner who now ran private inspections for farmers dealing with harassment, vandalism, and water rights disputes. Mitch wasn't a talker. He drove out 2 days later in a dull blue truck, did a slow lap of the perimeter, checked Liam's cameras, and asked for a full log of activity, including weather records, delivery times, and animal patterns. He didn't promise results, just said, "Let's see if your land's telling a different story than what they're trying to write." While Mitch was working, Liam noticed the shift in pressure. The email stopped. The phone was quiet. The fence line remained undisturbed for an entire week. Even Karen seemed to vanish from view. No bike rides, no SUV parked at the edge of the trail. The absence wasn't peace. It was the eye of a storm, and Liam knew it. People like Karen didn't stop. They waited, reassessed, and returned with leverage. That leverage came the following week, when a county assessor showed up unannounced with 2 assistants and a drone. The assessor claimed he was sent to verify a land use discrepancy flagged during recent topographic data updates. He spoke in bureaucratic riddles, danced around specifics, and kept referencing a digital elevation model Liam had never seen. When Liam asked for a copy of the order or who had filed the complaint, the man produced a printed form with several sections blacked out and a seal that looked more like a watermark than an actual county emblem. Mitch happened to be present that day and stepped in, asking direct questions the assessor clearly wasn't prepared to answer. Eventually, the team left without conducting a full assessment, but not before taking drone footage of Liam's barn and adjacent tool sheds. Later that night, Mitch said what Liam already suspected. "They're probing. This isn't about zoning or water. They're trying to find something, anything, they can use to force intervention." And so Liam braced. He didn't know when the next intrusion would come, or in what form, but he knew the boundaries had been breached. Not with wire cutters or crowbars, but with bureaucracy, language, and false legitimacy. This wasn't a dispute anymore. It was a quiet siege. And someone, somewhere in the shadows of Karen Beckett's smiling domain, was waiting for the moment when he blinked. He didn't plan to. The day the first physical confrontation happened, Liam Doyle had been working in the western field, welding together a new bracket for the irrigation manifold. It was quiet, unnaturally so, the kind of silence that made even the rustling trees feel staged. There was no wind, no buzz of insects, no birdsong riding the treetops. Just the pop and hiss of the welding arc and the sharp smell of ozone in the air. The sun was still climbing, casting a muted gold across the dry grass, when he caught something from the corner of his eye movement where there shouldn't have been any. He killed the arc, flipped up his visor, and turned slowly. At the far edge of his property, just beyond the tree line that bordered the disused utility path, a white truck idled in the clearing with its driver's side door open. 2 figures stood nearby, one with a clipboard, the other holding what looked like a soil auger. They weren't looking at him. They were looking down at the ground, measuring, testing, moving with quiet efficiency like they had done this before and weren't expecting to be stopped. Liam stood without saying a word. He didn't walk toward them. He didn't yell. He simply reached for his phone, opened the camera, and zoomed in, capturing the moment with steady hands. Then, deliberately, he walked to his ATV, mounted it, and rode the 1/4 mile down the slope without haste or panic. The engine echoed through the trees, and by the time he reached the clearing, both figures had turned to face him. One of them, a tall man in a pressed polo shirt bearing the logo of a landscaping company Liam didn't recognize, raised a hand in a gesture meant to suggest friendliness. The other, a woman in beige slacks and a sleeveless vest, stepped forward, clipboard clutched to her chest like a badge of authority. Before they could speak, Liam shut off the ATV and dismounted, planting his boots in the gravel with calm precision. "This is private property," he said evenly, locking eyes with the woman. "You're trespassing." She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "We're conducting an environmental assessment on behalf of the regional collective," she said, gesturing toward the clipboard. "There's been concern about potential runoff affecting nearby greenways. You have documentation granting access?" Liam asked. His voice didn't rise, but the weight in it made the man behind her shift uncomfortably. "We sent notice to the committee," she replied. "Everything has been coordinated through appropriate channels." "I'm not part of your committee," Liam said. "You're on my land. Not adjacent to it. Not bordering. On my land." The woman hesitated. That was all he needed. He stepped forward and pointed to the small stakes driven into the dirt, each one marked with color-coded flags. "Pull those up and leave," he said. The man with the auger opened his mouth to speak, then stopped himself and began gathering the stakes without another word. The woman didn't move. "You're interfering with a documented survey," she said. "You're interfering with my property rights," Liam countered. "And I have every minute of this interaction recorded. You walk off now, it stays quiet. You escalate it, it goes to the sheriff, the assessor's office, and the land commission." There was a beat of silence where no one moved. Then she turned, walked back to the truck without a word, and climbed in. The man followed, and they drove off without so much as a glance back. That evening, Liam filed a second formal report, this time including photos, timestamps, and the audio recording from his phone. He didn't expect enforcement, but he wanted a trail. People like Karen Beckett played long games, and Liam knew that sometimes the only defense against manufactured legitimacy was a longer paper record than theirs. But the next move wasn't subtle. The following morning, Liam found that someone had strung bright plastic construction ribbon along his eastern fence line, complete with printed signs that read, "A sensitive soil monitoring area. Do not disturb." They weren't attached to the public side of the fence. They were tied inside it, clearly meant to imply that the committee had claimed that stretch for observation. Liam ripped them down and photographed everything. Then he called Mitch, who promised to return within the week. Until then, Liam increased his patrols and rerouted his camera system to cover blind spots, extending coverage deeper into the trees. But they didn't come at night. They came in the open. 2 days later, Karen herself showed up. She stood just beyond the main gate, dressed in her usual suburban camouflage pastel blouse, pressed slacks, hair pulled back tight as a power cable. She wasn't alone. With her stood 2 men in black shirts, both wearing lanyards with generic-looking security tags clipped to their belts. Liam recognized the posture instantly. Not locals, not real enforcement, but hired muscle, the kind that only existed to suggest consequences without bearing legal authority. "Mr. Doyle," Karen called, smiling as though she were greeting an old friend at brunch. "I'd like a moment of your time, please." Liam stepped onto his porch, didn't wave, didn't move closer. "You're on private property," he said. "State your business or leave." Karen didn't flinch. She lifted a folded paper from her purse and waved it slightly. "This is a declaration of interest from the Greenway Planning Committee," she said. "We're expanding the habitat corridor. Your eastern parcel has been listed as an area of high ecological interest." "No one lists my land for anything without my consent," Liam replied. She gave him a sympathetic look. "I understand this feels invasive, but the larger project is about regional benefit. It's not personal. We're simply trying to protect shared environmental resources." "You mean steal," Liam said flatly. She laughed just once. "Come now. That's an ugly word." Liam descended the steps slowly, his boots thudding against the boards. "You think you're untouchable," he said. "You think if you frame it in soft language, wear a blazer and bring backup, I'll just roll over." Karen's smile didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. "I think you're underestimating how deeply we're embedded in this county," she said. Liam stopped walking. "And you're overestimating how much I care," he replied. For a second, something flickered in Karen's eyes, frustration, maybe fear. Then she turned, gave a brief nod to her companions, and walked away without another word. But Liam knew better. That wasn't retreat. That was gathering momentum. Sure enough, the next morning he found that his access road had been partially blocked by a fresh mound of gravel, dumped just past the tree line. Not enough to trap a vehicle, but enough to delay one. There was no label, no warning sign, no indication of construction. He checked the footage, nothing. Whoever had done it knew his blind spots, even after the camera adjustments. He spent the next 2 days clearing it by hand, not because he had no equipment, but because he needed to know every inch of what they had touched. Buried beneath the gravel, he found a rusted, tagged pipe cap, old municipal hardware, useless, but unmistakably placed. A warning. A marker. A territorial claim. That night, Liam sat at his desk, staring at a map of his property with red pins marking every incident, every encroachment, every maneuver. It looked like a slow invasion, not a property dispute, not a zoning conflict. A campaign. And he was done playing defense. He drafted a cease and desist letter, attached photographic evidence, and sent it to every address he had for the committee and its board members. He included Mitch Rowley's summary report and a legal advisory from the cooperative's attorney. He blind copied the county recorder's office, the state land commission, and 2 independent journalist contacts he'd never thought he'd need. He didn't ask for intervention. He gave warning. Then he waited. The silence that followed wasn't relief. It was the sound of a trap resetting, the kind that didn't snap until you stepped right onto it. And Liam Doyle had no intention of stepping anywhere unprepared. The shift didn't happen with a bang, but with a quiet erosion of normalcy. For nearly a week after sending out the cease and desist letters, Liam Doyle heard nothing, no emails, no unannounced visits, and no phone calls from unknown numbers masked as public utilities. It was, in the most unnerving sense, peaceful. The tension didn't lift, though. It changed shape. Silence from people like Karen Beckett didn't mean surrender, it meant planning. And Liam, who had spent much of his career spotting danger in what others overlooked, felt that prickling certainty that something had pivoted beneath the surface. He wasn't just being watched anymore, he was being mapped. It started with a phantom work order. One morning, a crew from a local tree service company arrived at the base of his western fence line. They weren't contractors Liam had ever hired or spoken to. There was no prior communication, no posted notice. Just 2 trucks, a wood chipper, and a team of uniformed men ready to begin perimeter maintenance, as their clipboard stated. When Liam approached, they were polite but vague, insisting the order had come from the cooperative initiative, a name that didn't exist in any official registry Liam could find. The crew leader offered to show the work order typed, printed, and bearing what looked like a scanned county logo, but the contact information listed led to a disconnected line. Liam didn't waste time. He told them, calmly but without room for negotiation, that the property was under protective status, any unauthorized work was a violation, and that if a single limb was cut, legal action would follow. The crew didn't argue. They packed up and left, mumbling about miscommunication and how they were just doing what the board requested. That evening, Liam cross-referenced every regional project involving habitat development, fire lane clearing, and conservation-funded upgrades. None included his coordinates. But buried in a newly updated online agenda from a local land commission meeting, he found a proposed resolution draft, marked as pending review. It was a motion to approve emergency conservation access to border-adjacent properties in interjurisdictional regions of hydrologic importance. The language was generic, legalistic, and deliberately vague, but the boundaries drawn in the map attached matched his eastern and southern perimeters down to the meter. The resolution hadn't been voted on, but its existence meant one thing: they weren't just pushing boundaries, they were trying to rewrite them. Liam printed every page and sent copies to Mitch Rowley. 2 days later, Mitch returned to the property, expression tight, holding a folder under his arm. "They're not going to come through the fence," he said. "They're going to walk through the courthouse." Inside the folder were public record pull requests, filed by someone representing the Juniper Hollow Committee. They weren't challenging his ownership, not directly. They were requesting zoning evaluations, land category audits, and tax status updates on his structures, particularly the barn. According to the documents, it had been flagged as potentially non-compliant due to unverified usage. The implication was subtle but dangerous. If the barn was reclassified from agricultural to commercial or mixed use, it could trigger fines, inspections, or even conditional seizure. Liam didn't panic. He acted. Over the next 72 hours, he had the barn formally surveyed, registered, and updated within state compliance records. He filed the paperwork personally at the county office, leaving no room for ambiguity or misfiled intention. On his way out, he spotted a familiar figure, one of the men who had stood beside Karen at his gate walking into the municipal building. Wearing a visitor's badge and carrying a folder identical to the one Mitch had brought. As their eyes met, the man gave a brief nod, the kind that wasn't polite but dismissive, and kept walking. Back on the property, Liam made another change. He installed a physical barrier at the southern trail entrance, a steel gate, chain-locked and mounted with a discreet but legally sufficient warning placard, "No public access. Agricultural property. Violators prosecuted." It was designed not to intimidate but to declare, unmistakably, that this was not shared space. Mitch approved. "Visual control," he said. "Let them see the line they're not allowed to cross." That same night, just past 2 a.m., Liam's security grid pinged a motion alert. One of the new boundary lights flickered, not from wind or wildlife, but because something had passed directly beneath it. The camera captured a brief blur, too fast to identify, but too precise to be random. Liam scanned every frame, every timestamp. One detail stood out, a reflection, not from a flashlight or phone, but from a small mirrored disc nailed into the ground near the gate. He retrieved it the next morning, thin, circular, professionally made. The kind used to help drones align when GPS was blocked. He didn't need to guess who put it there. The next day, Karen returned not with words, but with paper. Delivered by courier, the envelope bore the heading of a private law firm from another county. Inside were printed copies of a civil notice. The language was sterile, but the meaning was clear. Liam had been named in a claim of willful obstruction of regional environmental coordination, citing his installation of the southern gate as a violation of communal preservation pathways. It wasn't a lawsuit yet, but it was the legal equivalent of putting a knife on the table and waiting to see if the other person blinked. Liam read the notice once, calmly, then fed it into his shredder strip by strip. He knew posturing when he saw it, but he also knew the value of being prepared. He forwarded the documents to the cooperative's legal arm and requested immediate escalation to litigation review. Then he wrote a single-line reply to the sender's email address. "This land is not open for negotiation. Try it again, and I will respond with full rights under state and federal protection." He received no reply. The next evening he walked the full perimeter with his sidearm holstered, not because he expected trouble, but because he wanted to be sure he was seen. It wasn't about aggression. It was about presence. People like Karen didn't fear laws. They feared resistance. Somewhere in the woods to the east he heard movement, twigs snapping in the underbrush, the low crunch of deliberate footfalls. Not fast. Not running. Just watching, measuring, waiting. He didn't follow. He didn't chase. He simply turned on the nearest floodlight, stood in full view, and made it clear that he wasn't going anywhere. This land was his. And no amount of paperwork, persuasion, or passive sabotage was going to take it from him. The moment Liam Doyle realized things had passed the point of tactical games and passive pressure was not during some loud confrontation or threatening letter, it came in the form of silence so complete it rang in his ears. After weeks of fights, encroachments, and legal maneuvering, the campaign against his land had gone quiet again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the cautious withdrawal of someone reconsidering their strategy. It was the stillness of someone who had finally found the peace they needed and was waiting for it to fall into place. There were no more emails, no more sudden visits from assessors or surveyors, no more trucks parked along the outer fence pretending to be lost. Mitch had commented on it during their last phone call, noting that sometimes a pause meant paperwork was moving behind closed doors faster than out in the open. Liam agreed. The real damage, he knew, would come not through visible conflict, but through a single stroke of administrative fraud disguised as formality. That warning manifested the following Monday when a registered letter arrived bearing the seal of the Regional Planning Authority. It looked official, professional formatting, correct headers, even the right reference number for the district. But Liam's instincts went taut the second he began reading. The letter informed him that a formal complaint had been lodged against his property for illegal structure erection within an active conservation overlay, referring specifically to his southern gate and security barrier. Attached was an administrative warning that stated failure to respond within 10 days would result in summary penalties, including a conditional injunction on any modification to existing infrastructure. The language was precise, technical, and quietly damning. Buried in the final paragraph was the real hit, a statement noting that due to the nature of the complaint, the Planning Committee had temporarily reassigned his property to pending review. Status on the zoning map effectively stripping him, albeit temporarily, of the autonomy to make structural changes without approval. It was a bureaucratic trap disguised as a compliance review. Liam didn't hesitate. He immediately contacted the cooperative's legal team, who confirmed that the filing itself was real but improperly initiated it. It had been submitted through an emergency channel reserved for flood zone responses, completely irrelevant to his terrain. That alone was grounds for dismissal, but only if contested quickly and through the proper appeal route. He had 72 hours to submit a formal challenge. Mitch arrived the next morning with notarized declarations, visual documentation, and 3 comparative case references. Together, they crafted a response that not only refuted the claim, but challenged the legitimacy of the board's attempt to apply regional conservation status without public input. Liam personally drove the documents to the county administrative court, submitted them to the clerk, and watched her stamp each one with the kind of lethargic precision only a seasoned government worker could produce. He returned home feeling momentarily in control, tired but ahead. Until the dog stopped barking. His dog, Nash, was a rescue shepherd mix with a bark that could shake windows. He wasn't aggressive, but he was vigilant, and even the rustle of a raccoon or the hum of a passing drone would send him pacing along the porch with his ears sharp and his stance alert. But that night, Nash lay curled in his usual spot, unbothered, as Liam stepped outside to make his rounds. There had been motion alerts on the northeast perimeter, nothing too specific, just enough to warrant a check. As he passed the north corner of the barn, he felt the shift in temperature, first a faint chemical tang hanging in the still air. He slowed, instincts bristling, and scanned the ground. That's when he saw the pieces, shredded paper, a patch of disturbed dirt, and something glinting faintly beneath the beam of his flashlight. It was meat cut into small pieces, soaked in a milky residue. Liam didn't touch it. He took photos, collected a sample with a garden spade, and called Mitch immediately. The next day, a toxicologist confirmed trace amounts of denatonium benzoate, an industrial deterrent sometimes used to prevent animals from chewing wires. Non-lethal in small doses, but clearly not something that should be in meat left near a farmhouse. There were also faint traces of carbamate pesticide, illegal for residential use in the region. Whoever left it wasn't trying to poison the land. They were trying to disable the alarm system in canine form. That same evening, Liam reviewed his archived surveillance logs and noticed something strange. Between 2:13 and 2:26 a.m., 3 of his external cameras recorded visual disturbances, small bursts of static that didn't match wind interference or weather. It was targeted jamming, likely low range, probably deployed by someone who knew exactly which corners were weakest. He marked the coordinates, updated the firmware, and added a physical motion sensor backup tied directly to an internal circuit with no wireless interface. but he wasn't fast enough to stop the next move. 3 nights later, someone entered the utility shed behind the barn and opened the tool chest Liam used for storing backup power equipment. Nothing was taken. Nothing destroyed. Instead, a single item had been placed inside, a municipal service tag, the kind used by building inspectors, pre-stamped with a violation code and a barcode that didn't scan. Attached to it was a note, handwritten in perfect practice cursive, "You're not helping the neighborhood by resisting." There was no name, just a signature line left blank. That note turned resistance into confirmation. They weren't just testing boundaries anymore. They were confident, Mitch advised, moving fast. The next day, they filed a harassment complaint through the sheriff's department and a private suit against unnamed agents of coordinated disruption, backed by the legal cooperative. It was a tactical move, a paper anchor that let them subpoena any involved party once a name or organization was confirmed. That afternoon, Karen returned. She didn't approach the gate. She didn't call out. She simply parked her SUV across the gravel path, got out, and stood behind the gate with her arms crossed. Liam was watching from the porch with binoculars, not hiding, not posturing. She stared straight ahead, unmoving for nearly 6 minutes. Then she turned, opened the trunk, and removed a yard sign, the kind printed by neighborhood committees during election seasons. She didn't plant it in the ground, but instead leaned it against the outer side of the fence. The words were printed in bright green over white: "Protect our greenway, say no to private hoarding." It wasn't an accusation. It was a narrative. Liam walked down the path calmly, stopped 2 feet from the gate, and looked at her through the bars. "I see you've given up on subtlety," he said. Karen didn't answer. "You're losing control," he continued, voice even. "You've thrown everything you have: legal pressure, intimidation, lies, and I'm still here." She smiled. It wasn't smug. It was something else, calm, eerie, resolved. "You won't be," she said softly. Then she left. The next day, Liam's property was tagged on an open-access community forum as potentially harmful to local ecology, submitted by a username that matched one of Karen's assistant committee members. Photos were attached, zoomed-in shots of stacked fertilizer, fuel tanks, and irrigation piping, all taken from angles that meant only one thing: someone had been inside the fence, not along it. Inside. The comment thread beneath the post was small, quiet, but full of loaded terms: non-compliant, risk to shared wildlife, unmonitored runoff. There was no call to action, no accusations of criminality, just the slow drip of narrative control constructing a story where Liam was the problem and Karen was the solution. Liam filed takedown requests. The site responded slowly, citing review protocols. That night, he moved the fuel tanks indoors, locked the irrigation valve box, and posted laminated legal warnings at every gate. He wasn't reacting. He was reinforcing. People like Karen wanted you to lash out, to make a mistake, to step outside the lines just enough for them to paint you as the threat. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. But the line had been crossed. The silence was gone. And from now on, every step she took toward his land would cost her something. Because Liam Doyle had reached the point where preservation and retaliation were one and the same. The metallic clatter behind Liam Doyle's workshop was too deliberate to be an accident. He didn't react with panic or confusion. He moved with calm, practiced control, sliding on his boots and checking his weapon as if following a long memorized drill. He already knew what this was. The sensors had triggered again in the same blind spot he had just reinforced days before. He didn't need to see the screen to know someone was there, and not by mistake. They were on his land, again, and this time they weren't sneaking around. They were operating like they belonged there. The camera feed confirmed it: 2 figures, dark-clothed, one crouched at the back door of the barn with a metal tool in hand, the other standing watch nearby, scanning the tree line with what looked like an IR flashlight. Neither wore uniforms or carried ID. They moved efficiently, not like criminals, but Like contractors, people used to being in restricted places, people who believed the paper in their pockets could protect them even where the law could not. That alone told Liam everything he needed to know. He didn't yell or flip on floodlights. He took the long route, flanking the intruders by circling around the low ridge that shadowed the barn. Boots crunching through the brush, he stepped silently until he reached the edge of the clearing. He knelt beneath a low tree, took a breath, and raised the rifle. The tactical light snapped on in a sharp arc, locking both figures in its white beam. Step away from the door. The one holding the saw froze instantly. The other blinked, half-raised a hand, and stammered something about a neighborhood watch. Liam didn't answer. "You're on private land," he said, steady and flat. "Drop your gear and walk." The man with the tool hesitated, body language already shifting into fight or flight calculation. Liam didn't move, didn't blink. "You've got 5 seconds. The tool hit the ground with a heavy metallic thud. Liam motioned with the rifle's barrel. Hands visible. "Walk forward. Show me how you got in." They led him across the clearing, silent now, no more attempts at lying or charming their way out. They passed the sheds, followed the path to the eastern fence line, and stopped at a section where the padlock had been sliced clean through and tossed aside. Bolt cutters lay in the grass just beyond the gate. "Pick them up. Toss them out. Both of you through the gate." They complied. Liam didn't follow them. Instead, he took out a flare from his jacket pocket, struck it hard against the gatepost, and tossed it out after them. It hissed to life with a burst of red-orange light, casting long shadows over their retreating forms. "If you come back, I won't be this polite." They didn't argue. They didn't run. They just disappeared into the woods. Liam stood there until the flare burned low. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shaken. He was done pretending this was about misunderstandings, about property lines or zoning issues. This was pressure applied until something broke. But he wasn't the one breaking. Back at the house, the message was waiting. Nailed to the front gate was a laminated copy of a zoning complaint, one he had already disputed weeks ago, but this version was altered. The reference number had been redacted, the signature blacked out, and a phrase was written across the top in black marker with deliberate, elegant strokes: "Noncompliance breeds consequences." He took it down without a word and brought it inside. He didn't bother calling the sheriff or alerting Mitch immediately. Instead, he laid the paper out on the kitchen table, poured a cup of coffee, and stared at it. The weight of the moment wasn't in the threat itself, but in the method. Someone wanted him to feel surrounded. They wanted to strip the legal framework out from under him, turn the system into their weapon, and frame his resistance as an obstacle to progress. He wasn't surprised. He was prepared. By the following day, he had already shared the updated evidence with a retired federal investigator, one of the cooperative's last resort contacts, a man who'd spent years dismantling shell company land grabs and coordinated property harassment schemes. Together, they reviewed the footage, the altered documents, the audio logs, and the coordinated timing of intrusions. It was enough. Enough to build a case that would hold under pressure. Enough to put names on the record. The investigators' initial findings connected several of the incidents to a known land trust operating under benign-sounding community development titles. They weren't buying land. They were targeting it, flagging independent properties as obstruction zones, softening their market viability through regulatory pressure, and then making inflated buyout offers through intermediaries. 2 board members from the neighboring community were listed in the network's extended donor circle. Liam filed a formal federal complaint, not through local channels, not through the county. He sent it directly to the Land Commission, the state auditor, and the Attorney General's office. No middlemen. No delays. If they were going to play above the law, then so would he legally, but unapologetically. When Karen Beckett returned, she didn't bring another inspector or a false survey crew. She came herself, standing on the gravel drive outside the locked gate with a manila folder in hand. She didn't shout. She didn't posture. She simply held the folder out and waited. Liam watched her through binoculars from the porch, unmoved, then walked down with slow, deliberate steps. When he opened the gate just enough to take the folder, she smiled. "It's a generous offer," she said. "Fair price, full relocation support. You'll be free of all this nonsense." Liam didn't look at the papers. He didn't speak. "You're the last barrier," she continued. "Everything else has moved forward. The narrative is set. You're just making this harder than it needs to be." He looked her in the eyes and said, "Then stop standing on my land." He shut the gate. Then, without ceremony, he tore the offer in half and let it fall at her feet. She didn't bend to pick it up. She didn't speak again. She simply turned, walked back to her vehicle, and drove away. Liam stood there long after she vanished from view. The fire had been lit, and he had just fed it every scrap of false diplomacy she thought would buy him out. 3 weeks passed without a single vehicle pulling up to Liam Doyle's gate. No emails, no strangers lingering along the tree line, no cryptic packages or threats pinned to fences. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful, like a forest holding its breath before a storm. But the storm never came. What did arrive instead without fanfare or warning was a thick envelope from the State Attorney General's office. Liam opened it slowly, setting it down on the porch table beside his coffee cup, eyes scanning each page with measured calm. The response was clear, written in careful legal language but carrying unmistakable weight. The land use complaint filed against his property had been found to contain falsified identifiers and misrepresented citations. Moreover, the use of emergency zoning codes to justify harassment constituted grounds for civil penalty. While the investigation was ongoing and criminal referrals were under consideration, the letter affirmed one thing in plain terms: Liam's property stood fully recognized, but fully protected and unencumbered. No restrictions. No oversight. No further attempts at jurisdictional intrusion would be tolerated without direct state authorization. Liam read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in the fireproof safe behind the kitchen wall. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. But the weight that had lived in his shoulders for the past year lifted quietly, completely. He knew what this meant. Not just the end of the legal campaign against him, but the withdrawal of the people behind it. Karen Beckett and her board were not going to face criminal charges, not directly. The investigator had explained it to him clearly. While the pressure they applied was malicious, it was shielded behind too many bureaucratic curtains to pin with full prosecutorial certainty. But they had lost their grip. After the federal complaint was filed and the evidence submitted, the Land Trust's local development initiative was frozen under audit. Multiple permits were suspended, and the county commission passed an emergency motion to require full transparency from any public-private community coalition that is involved in land use. In simple terms, the loopholes they'd used to squeeze people like Liam had been sealed shut. Liam didn't expect an apology from Karen. He never got one. What he did receive delivered by courier without return address was a single sheet of paper listing properties recently sold by Juniper Hollow's board members, including Karen's. The last entry showed her personal residence listed as under contract. Whether she moved out of embarrassment, legal caution, or strategic retreat, he didn't care. What mattered was that she was gone. The gate across from his eastern border sat unmanned, unused. The artificial trail signs were removed. No more false conservation claims. No more fabricated easements. It was over. The security systems remained. Liam kept every motion sensor, every reinforced lock, every camera. Not out of paranoia, but out of principle. He had earned the right to defend his land, and no legal victory was reason enough to lower his guard. The barn remained intact, the fencing untouched. Nash, fully recovered and more alert than ever, resumed his nightly patrols, ears twitching at every rustle in the brush. Liam didn't change his routine. He still walked the perimeter every morning, still cleaned the equipment by hand, still reviewed every security log. But now he did it with the quiet knowledge that no one was coming for what he had built, not anymore. The legal team from the cooperative contacted him one last time to confirm final closure. His case had been archived as a precedent, a model for how private landowners could fight back against soft invasion tactics through layered legal resilience and tactical preparedness. They offered to use it in seminars, training materials, future litigation. Liam agreed on one condition: no names, no photographs, no profiles. He didn't want a spotlight. He didn't need validation. What he needed, and what he finally had, was sovereignty. He posted a new sign at the gate, clean white aluminum, bolted directly into the frame, no rust, no fading. It read simply, private property, protected, not negotiable. Neighbors began to treat him differently. Not with fear or distance, but with something closer to earned respect. People who had never spoken to him beyond passing glances now nodded when they saw him at the market. One older man, who had stayed neutral during the worst of the campaign, approached him outside the feed store, extended a calloused hand, and said, "Didn't think anyone would hold the line like that. Glad you did." Liam nodded, took the hand, and said nothing. He never spoke about what happened in detail. When asked, he'd shrug and say, "They tried, and they failed." That was enough. The story didn't need to become folklore. It just needed to serve as fact. The land, in the end, was exactly what he'd wanted it to be when he bought it: quiet, strong, and entirely his. No hidden claims. No masked developers. No committees. Just soil, structure, and sky. The conflict that had started with polite letters and ended with forced entry, surveillance, and criminal intimidation had been answered with unshakable resolve. Not rage. Not revenge. Just resistance made permanent. The kind of resistance that made sure no one ever tried it again. And with that, Liam Doyle closed the gate behind him for the last time that season, not because he was leaving, but because no one else was getting in.